Thank you all for coming today. This is the fourth in our Carbon Capture 101 or Carbon Lunch briefing series on the status of carbon capture, where are we now. So we're going to do a brief overview of the host organizations, CURC, the Global CCUS Institute, and the Carbon Capture Coalition in just a minute. But right now we have the pleasure of being joined by Congressman McKinley of West Virginia. And to introduce him, I'm going to bring up one of our CURC members from West Virginia University, Jim Wood.
Yes, sir. There's a little bit to say about Congressman McKinley here, which I'll read, but there's one or two things that I don't think are here, which I want to mention. David McKinley has represented the 1st District of West Virginia since January 3rd, 2011. He's also my congressman. Congressman McKinley is chairman of the House Coal Caucus, and in that role has been champion for carbon capture policies and for funding technology development at DOE. What Mike didn't mention was that I did spend 4 years at DOE in fossil energy, and some of the things that come out of Congress are very important for us in terms of appropriations to move forward on carbon capture, which you'll hear about later today. Mr. McKinley was the lead Republican co-sponsor of the Fossil Energy Research and Development Act and the USIT Act, and he co-sponsored legislation to reform the Section 45Q tax credit that was eventually enacted into law in last year's budget agreement. In this Congress, the Congressman introduced the Carbon Capture Modernization Act to reform Section 48A tax credit and co-sponsored the reintroduced version of the USIT Act. One of the things that is not generally known is that there are very few engineers that are in Congress. And Congressman McKinley is one of the engineers who can talk about policy and can talk about engineering. So as an engineer myself, I'm very, very happy that he's my congressman and we talk frequently about engineering. Congressman McKinley.
Thank you for the introduction, and let me show of hands here as we get started. This is the 4th in the series. How many of you have been to the all previous 3? 1. Come on, that's what this thing's about. It's a series. We got to have a continuation. We're engineers. We build off what we've learned from the previous one. So that's where we are here today. I'm going to probably be pretty generic in my remarks and how we might go, but so climate change is certainly taking a center stage in this 116th Congress. This is my 5th term, and I've never seen it so dominate that something can move in to get the attention it has. We're seeing it in appropriations, we're seeing it in committee hearings. There even was a select committee put together on this issue. So there's no question this is an issue we better address. Now, I think, quite frankly, it's one of just, Jim just said, one of just 2, think about it, 2 licensed engineers in Congress. Now, there are 242 attorneys. Not that there's anything wrong with the attorneys, but it's an interesting balance when you're going to deal with some of these things. So both sides, I think I can tell you that I think we agree we got to do something on climate. There's something that's going on out there. Any of us that have done any research, we understand the temperature is 1.4 degrees warmer. The oceans have risen 8 inches in the last 100+ years. We know something's going on. And I think we agree that we have to do something. And we agree, I think that man is contributing to some form, maybe not all, but some significant portion of the anthropogenic climate change. As we pursue this elusive goal, we have to understand we disagree. We may agree that it's happening. We disagree vehemently on how to approach it, what to do with it. And because of this topic, it's one of the most defining programs between the 2 parties as we develop on this. And what we've come to a fork in the road. One, we can go down this one path that some are advocating to just simply do away with all fossil fuels. That's a simple approach. We can do that. The other is through innovation. Can we reduce the emissions and continue to use fossil fuels as part of our mix? So let's start with the first. So if we did away with fossil fuels, we know that's an option. First, the pros with it, we get to 100% renewables pretty quickly. We'd have clean, natural energy. We'd have zero emissions with that. We could pat ourselves in the back. We really accomplished something in America by doing this, because we decarbonized America with that. Some of the negatives, you understand, if we go down that path of eliminating fossil fuels entirely, that we know from studies done by the American Action Forum study that said that utility rates for consumers will go up approximately as much as 286%, or a $4,000 increase per household. Just make sure that when we make a policy decision whether we want to go in that direction. We also need to understand too about reliability. Any of us that I've served on Energy and Commerce Committee since I got here, and a lot of the worry on Energy and Commerce is the grid reliability. So we look at what Moniz, Secretary Moniz, maybe some of you remember him, Ernie Moniz, when he was here. Ernie Moniz has said that 100%, and he said it as recently as February, that 100% renewables is not realistic in the short term, and certainly not cost effective now. And he added further, he said, until battery storage improves drastically, renewables cannot provide baseload power. That's that direction if we go into, remember what we're saying here, we've taken that course, we're exploring if we go down the thing of doing away with fossil fuels. Moniz's own group said that during 2017, his own study has found out that during 2017, 90 days, California went without the ability to generate solar or wind. Interesting. So let's kind of pull this back together. This is not a global response if we take this route, because what it is just would be focused on America. And I think what we have to understand is we need a broader context, because no one country can be blamed for these problems. It is a global issue. Everybody is emitting CO2. America is just one of them. Gene McCarthy, the former EPA director, said as much. He said, what we do in the United States, we have no impact on global environment. MIT came out with a study and said, acting alone, it makes no difference what America does in fighting back on climate change until India and China change their policies on using fossil fuels. So we're keeping that in mind, because in the end of the day, Asia has this voracious appetite for using fossil fuels. It's the cheapest form of creating electricity. They're not backing off. We already know that in Asia, in the next 5 years, between 4 years, by 23, they will have increased on average 5% using fossil fuels annually. Now, look at the emissions. The United States, between 2000 and 2016, the United States reduced its emissions by 16% of CO2 emissions. But what about China and India? China increased its emissions by 290%, and India has increased theirs by 235%. So we're already moving in the right direction, but we've got to get we've got for them to understand what's happening globally. They've got to do some action as well with it. So without this global commitment, keeping the text in mind, 70% of the energy that we create in America comes from fossil fuels. So just understand, if we adopt this, if we go down that one path, we've got to eliminate 70%, replace 70% of our energy mix with renewables. Can it be done? Of course it can be done, and it will be done. The question is, what's the timing? How do we time it? How do we work it down through that? Because let's keep in mind, if we do nothing, or excuse me, if we do this, and the rest of the world doesn't do anything, what are the problems? America? Yeah, we can, let's say we can pat ourselves in the back. What a great job we've done. But if the rest of the world doesn't join us, we're still going to have global climate, heavy storms, we're going to have rising oceans, We're still going to have droughts. We're still going to have firestorms. So despite what we've done, we're still going to, and worse, Miami and the coastal communities are still going to flood because the rest of the world is continuing to use it. China is emitting 9 billion with a B, 9 billion tons of CO2 annually. India is emitting almost 3 billion tons of CO2 annually. And American coal-fired power plants, 1.2 billion tons. We can change, but unless the rest of the world do it, we're still going to flood. So, what's the alternative plan? That's what I think CURC is trying to do. That's the route they're promoting. This alternative plan, which is innovation, research, development, finding how we can use it. So we want to use fossil fuels, but we want to decrease emissions through innovation, efficiency, and research. Now, this approach can be bipartisan, and one that Marc and Veasey out of Texas and we work together, our offices are working together, using that as approach. But what we see time and time again, if that's the fork in the road we take on innovation and research, then we have to fund research. And unfortunately, in the last few years, every time the appropriation process, they cut people on some, I'm not going to say either party, but not everybody embraces going down that fork in the road. So they keep reducing, cutting back on research into fossil fuels. So that's forcing us to go that other route. And that's, I'm hoping I help get you to understand the other route. So why are we doing this? Keep in mind, put it on perspective. The United States spends more on potato chips than we do on energy research. And what are our priorities? What are we doing? If we're going to make that a manual of leadership globally on energy, to be able to capture our CO2, because we know that's the culprit, we've got to make our commitment to this. So the cons to support this approach, it's politically unpopular. People don't want to. A lot of politically are saying, we want you to not use coal and fossil fuels and gas. It's a negative. Research is expensive, and it's unpredictable, the outcome with that. But the pros on this, we restore our mantle of leadership globally. People are going to turn to us because we've got the capability with our 17 national energy technology laboratories and private laboratories all across America. We can come up with solutions to be able to do this because the idea of having massive increases in our utility bills versus doing the research to be able to do this and to be able to sell that globally, it can be helpful. So keep in mind, during the last polar vortex that we had, the ISO out in the Midwest had to rely on a 50% increase on the use of fossil fuels to get through that storm. If we had done away with that, we would have had a real serious problem, and America would have had a black eye during a very bad weather storm. So we've got to be careful the direction we're going with it. So, and I want to get to a point where we can export this technology, commercialize it. Because we've got to sell it to India and China and Japan and Indonesia and Germany to use this so that they lower their carbon footprint as well. Because even if we do all of it, it won't have the impact on the globe. So we've already seen some success. Petronova down in Texas is showing that we can make progress through research. Then you have Net Power. Net Power is a gas-fired plant down there. First one in America with 0 emissions. Now think about that. That's what the product of research can do about this. We have other things. We can do direct air capture. I'm hoping through research we can do things with phytoplankton, because we know phytoplankton provides more oxygen through photosynthesis process than any other source that we have in the globe. But we're not doing the research into that arena. So the outcome, if we go this route of research, we're going to get improved battery storage. We're going to have a new fleet of next generation nuclear reactors. We're going to have reduced emissions by far. But on top of that, we're going to have these advanced energy technologies that we're going to be able to market that technology around the world. Because keep in mind, China and India are not walking away from fossil fuels. It's too cheap for them to make their electricity using that. So our office, you heard Jim say, we worked last year on the 45Q. We're working on 48A, try to get that. We know the research is how we're going to work our way through this. But let me just kind of close here on this. Working with Peterson and Veasey, that's the kind of bipartisan approach we need to take. Not combating each other, but we work together. Now, just remember, this is a global climate change. As Mitsubishi, this is not an American climate change. We have to change this globally if we're going to address this issue. And it has to be treated as such. Too many of my colleagues, quite frankly, I think are still just staring at this fork in the road. They don't know which way to go. They're caught. It's the saying I learned years ago. There's a time to paint, get off the ladder. Make a choice. Which way we're going to go. I would suggest if we go the route of innovation, it's going to help our economy. It's going to remobilize our laboratories to be able to do the research. The rest of the world can turn to us for their leadership. And as a result of that, I think you'll see us being able to commercialize a process of lowering carbon emissions that we can market them to all those nations I referred to earlier. They're using fossil fuels around the world because they're not doing the approach that we have. You can see that with China increasing 290% and we're 16% reduction. We're moving in the right direction. We just got to take it further. So to that end, I look forward to working with your bosses and anyone else that's here in the room, people that we might be able to pull something together to keep this a bipartisan approach. I know the direction I'm going in. I'm not staring at this fork in the road trying to determine which way to go. Going down one way doesn't end very pretty. The other end, I think we can be proud of American leadership. So I thank you for the chance to talk to you, and I thank you for the work that CURC has done so far. God bless all.
Thank you, Mr. McKinley, for those opening remarks. And as you can see, this is a pretty hot topic. We got a lot of carbon dioxide, I think, in this room today. So this is a great showing. Thank you all for coming. In the interest of time, I'm just going to turn it over very quickly with a brief introduction to Congressman Veasey, if I could do so. So Congressman Marc Veasey, for those of you who are not familiar, serves Texas's 33rd District in the House of Representatives. He was appointed in this Congress to serve on the Energy and Commerce Committee. And I want to point out that while he was on the Science Committee last year, it was Chairman Veasey that led in the development of a very important piece of legislation called the Fossil Energy Research and Development Act of 2018. We are involved right now in a big effort to reintroduce that bill again this year, the 2019 bill. But as you will all know, or you may hear about, the bill is really emphasizing the need to address carbon capture from the use of fossil fuels. So Congressman Veasey, I just want to applaud you for your leadership on this issue, and thank you, and turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. How's everybody doing today? Good, good. Well, I'm glad to be here and just appreciate us having such a good, robust turnout to talk about this very important topic, and that's our energy sector's future, our energy security, and trying to make our environment cleaner. I think that's something that all of us should be able to get behind. First, I want to give special thanks to Michael Weiner, Director of Coalition Services for CURC, and the members of the Carbon Utilization Research Council. I'm honored to represent Texas in the United States House of Representatives. Texas represents the largest share of oil and gas industry in the country. And Texas is the leading crude oil producing state and the largest natural gas producer. And Texans will also tell you, some will, that we actually do renewable energy better than most people do, definitely in the country. If you look at our wind portfolio and our solar portfolio in the state of Texas, and a lot of people will even tell you that we do it better than the EU. So, very proud to be a Texan. And in order for us to continue this economic success, it's necessary for our state to lead the way in trying to make oil and gas cleaner and safer for the environment and public health. Since the Industrial Revolution, the birth of fossil fuel-based economy, the world has seen a sharp increase in atmospheric greenhouse gases and a warming climate due directly to human activity. There is no question about that. Reducing these emissions and finding technology solutions to these realities is a pressing challenge. It requires a stable public investment in our academic institutions and national laboratories, alongside significant partnerships with private industry. That is why I introduced HR 5745 that was mentioned earlier, the Bipartisan Fossil Energy Research and Development Act of 2018 during the last Congress. Hope to work with Mr. McKinley of West Virginia in the coming weeks on getting that reintroduced. The bill would authorize critical activities within DOE's Office of Fossil Energy. This office is responsible for stewarding research to reduce emissions, improve efficiency, and mitigate the environmental impacts of energy generation from fossil fuels. A large portion of this research focuses on developing carbon capture technologies and demonstrating the uses and storage methods for captured CO2. The Fossil Energy R&D Act would reauthorize and expand research, development, and demonstration of these technologies for power plants, including large-scale pilot projects that would fill a vital gap in DOE's current portfolio of projects in this area. The bill also authorizes R&D activities in carbon storage, rare earth elements, and I hope that people really keep paying attention to rare earth elements. I think that's going to be an issue now, but even moving further into the future that we're going to have to spend a lot of time talking about. And carbon utilization. It also supports significant improvements in efficiency, including the development of supercritical CO2 technologies. In addition, the bill will launch important new initiatives in carbon dioxide removal, methane leak detection, mitigation, and carbon dioxide pipelines. Finally, it would put in place key reforms in DOE's Fossil Energy Laboratory, the National Energy Technology Laboratory located in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Oregon. Authorizing these technologies will benefit the environment, the U.S. economy, and provide technology solutions to global partners aiming to cut emissions. I want to thank everybody for coming here to discuss what Congress is doing to propel our energy future, protect our energy security and the independence and freedom that we have in this country, and also to protect our environment. I want to take this opportunity to stress that the critical work authorized in these pieces of legislation are supported by a wide variety of stakeholders, including representatives from industry, academia, labor, environmental organizations. I also want to give, again, special thanks to everyone at the Carbon Utilization Research Council for their support of last year's legislation. I look forward to working with everybody in the future, and thank you again. Thank you for letting me have a few minutes.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm going to turn it over to Lee. We appreciate your leadership on these issues.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're so grateful to be able to have Congressman Veasey and McKinley speak here today. So it's a pleasure to welcome you, so many of you, for this fourth Carbon Lunch, which again has exceeded our expectations, and it really shows that carbon capture and storage finally gains the spotlight it deserves. So my name is Beck. I'm a senior advisor at the Global CCUS Institute. We're an international think tank backed by governments and businesses, and we're currently represented in 7 countries. Carbon Lunches is co-hosted, however, by the Global CCUS Institute, the Carbon Utilization Research Council, which is an industry group, and led by Shannon and Angielski, together with Mike Weiner, and then finally also by the Carbon Capture Coalition, who is also brings together a diverse set of stakeholders to advocate for carbon capture and storage, and whose co-directors Brad Crabtree from the Great Plains Institute and Jeff Bobek from CCUS can't be here today, unfortunately. So we came together earlier this year to really think about how to make carbon capture and storage cool and to bring it closer to all of you. So Our goals were really to communicate the role of carbon capture in the global energy transition, to educate what is actually meant by carbon capture. After all, it's a suite of technologies, and also to dispel any misperception that carbon capture isn't a real solution. We're also very grateful for a wealth of supporters or supporting organizations, including the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Great Plains Institute, Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, ClearPath, Clean Air Task Force, and Third Way. So this is the fourth briefing, as we've said so far. So until now, we've discussed, we've covered a lot of ground. So the first briefing really discussed the role of CCUS in reducing emissions to net zero by mid-century. The second provided details on its applications both in the power and industrial sectors. And then the last one talked about CO2 utilization, CO2 storage, and direct air capture. You can view all of these briefings and carbon lunches online on the websites of the Carbon Utilization Research Council and the Global CCS Institute in case you weren't able to join us. So before I introduce our first speaker, according to the International Energy Agency, 70% of investment in the energy system will be either a direct result of government policy or directly by governments. As such, the fate of the energy transition lies with governments like yourself and policymakers like yourself. So we're looking to policymakers and decision makers and influencers like yourself to really hammer out the solutions and policy framework to enable that transition. So with this, it is really an honor for me to introduce today's first speaker, Marc Ackiewicz, who's the Director for the Division of Carbon Capture and Storage Research and Development at the Department of Energy. We're extremely excited to have him here for this particular discussion, which will cover the status of carbon capture, 45Q, and the U.S. efforts, because he has a wealth of experience both on the international level and on the national front. At DOE, he's responsible for planning, managing, and administering the division's R&D portfolio. Before joining DOE in 2007, he worked as a consultant and in the private sector in various industrial research and engineering positions. Marc holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering and a Master's in Engineering Management. Marc, thanks so much for joining us today and to show that what the U.S. government has done so far on carbon capture, which has been more than any other government in the world. Thank you.
So thanks, Lee, for the introduction. And what I'm going to do today, and first of all, thank you all for attending. It's great to see so much interest in carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So what I'm going to do is in the 15 minutes, kind of give you, rather than the elevator speech, which is maybe a 1 or 2 minute deal, I'm going to give you maybe the cab ride through CCUS and some of the things that we're doing in the DOE program. So. As Lee mentioned, I think one key takeaway from this is that the U.S. is one of, if not the global leaders in this space in terms of technology development, deployment, innovation. So we really are on the cutting edge of a lot of this work. So just a quick slide on where are we in terms of, say, large-scale development and deployment. In DOE, 3 large-scale projects that we have from our demonstration program. Air Products, which is looking at steam methane reforming. Petronova, which was mentioned, coal-fired power plant and capturing the CO2 and utilizing it for enhanced oil recovery. And then also for an ethanol facility in Illinois, the ADM facility. All told, these projects so far have captured and injected over 8.5 million tons per year of CO2. So clearly showing that CCUS is an option, not just focused on the power sector, but also industrial sources, and it's at scale as well. So just taking the next slide in terms of our federal investments in R&D, relatively stable over the past 4 years or so, right around that 200 million mark. About half of that is focused on carbon capture R&D, about another 45% on carbon storage, and then the last 5% is on utilization. And when I'm talking about utilization in this context, it's non-enhanced oil recovery. So it's looking at things like algae, converting it to mineralization and other fuels. in terms of our R&D program at DOE, what are we really focused on? So in each of these areas, looking at capture first, it's really reducing the cost of CO2 capture. Back in 2012, had it estimated at roughly about $80 per ton. About 3 years ago, about $60 per ton. So we're trying to cut that in half through our research and development programs. What plays a big role in that are capital costs, energy penalty, but then also integrating these systems within plants. Looking at carbon utilization, very similar, looking to drive down the cost, energy penalty, but life cycle for a lot of these is really important, ensuring that if you are utilizing CO2, that it's having a net benefit in terms of CO2 reductions. In terms of geologic storage, looking at improving monitoring and simulation of the subsurface, and really trying to get to this concept of real-time control and management. So I'll take a little bit of a step into that as we go along. But before I dive into the CCUS, I do want to take a step back and look broader in terms of power generation and looking at, say, coal-fired power generation. And one of the programs that we have at DOE is called Coal First, which stands for Flexible, Innovative, Resilient, Small, and Transformative Technology. So it's really trying to take that next step of generation and deployment and looking at coal-fired systems. And you may wonder, well, why would we want to do this? Well, efficiency is a big part of CO2 reduction. So the more efficient we can make these plants, there's that benefit that you have in terms of CO2 reductions itself. It helps on the capture side. And really looking at in Coal First, it's really looking at trying to develop that next series of power generation and innovation for coal-fired systems. And by the way, they're all going to have carbon dioxide capture as part of these systems as well. So one thing I do want to mention, so this is kind of a broad look at our carbon capture R&D portfolio, and I'm going to hit this at a bit of a high level. There's post and pre-combustion capture. Post is basically capturing the CO2 after the fuel's been combusted. Pre is looking at, say, if you were converting fossil fuels like methane, natural gas, to hydrogen. Well, before you combust that hydrogen, you would remove the CO2 before that process. So that's what the pre-combustion is looking at. And within each of these areas, we're looking at a whole host of different technologies. Solvents, which are, your conventional amine solvents are what are used today. Solid sorbents, membranes, and then novel concepts that either integrate multiple areas of these technologies. Different ways to go about doing this in terms of innovation. It's really about looking at materials, chemistry, looking at the processes and the engineering around it, looking at the equipment, also advanced manufacturing. How can we leverage advanced manufacturing techniques to really make some of these systems more efficient and actually be able to integrate in some of these plants. So 20 years of R&D in this space, over 200 roughly R&D projects at small scale all the way up to pilot scale, which is where we're moving some of our technologies today up into that pilot scale to get them ready for deployment. So in terms of the future, what are we looking at? Again, $30 per ton for our carbon capture technologies. Most of these, we think we have some options that we're looking at at the lab scale that have potential. It was mentioned earlier, direct air capture. We do have some small investments in this area already. And frankly, looking at, if I go back, this isn't just about coal-fired power generation. The technologies that we're developing also have applicability to natural gas systems, industrial sources, and also potentially for direct air capture as well. But again, that's an area that we see where there's growing interest. Looking at process development and design, carbon capture simulation initiative. How can we leverage advanced computing, high-performance computing technologies, exascale, to really accelerate the development and deployment of some of these technologies. Technology validation is critically important, as any engineer knows. Trying to validate these as you go through the process steps is critically important to make sure that industry has surety and comfort in moving forward with the technologies. One of the things that we have right now out, we had a funding opportunity announcement for FEED studies. That stands for front-end engineering design for commercial carbon capture plants, both for coal and natural gas. So really looking to kind of take that next step in terms of commercial deployment. And then finally, we have some large-scale pilots as well that we're looking at. In terms of utilization, we break it down into 3 areas. Biological capture, which was mentioned, kind of looking at the algae type concept. Fuels and chemicals. You know, CO2 is a really tough molecule to crack. It's thermodynamically very stable. So, but are there ways that you can use, say, some novel catalysts and other techniques to really convert that into other products? And then mineralization and cements, and there's actually been a lot of advancement in that area, not just through our R&D program, but elsewhere. Companies like Solidia, Carbon Cure, and others have really made some advances in this area. But you know, not the solution to all the CO2. But if you look at it in terms of, say, can it take, 5% of CO2 from a power plant, that's 5% less CO2 that you have to inject. It's helping monetize some of that CO2 value. So it helps, start making the economics look a lot more favorable. So in terms of carbon storage, just hitting some of the highlights, one of the big opportunities or activities that we've had have been the regional carbon sequestration partnerships, which started back in 2003, 2005, and they're starting to wind down their phase 3 efforts. Basically looking at what are the sources and sinks of CO2 throughout the U.S. So we broke it into 7 regions and also include some Canadian partners as well and part of these efforts. Really trying to identify how much geologic storage capacity is there, how close is it to some of the sources, and doing some large-scale testing of, what sort of technologies are viable, what works, what doesn't work, how does the geology different, how do these technologies, react differently in various geology. Building off that effort, we went to something called Carbon Safe, which is really looking at how do you do this at, say, commercial scale, 50 million metric tons of CO2. So something that you might take, say, for a large power plant or industrial source operating, say, for 25, 30 years. Looking at offshore storage, how can we leverage, say, infrastructure down in the Gulf Coast, where there's a lot of infrastructure in the Gulf. How can we leverage that for CO2 storage or enhanced soil recovery? Brine extraction storage tests. So this is something where, if you're injecting, say, into saline formations in the subsurface, can we remove some of that brine, both for pressure management, but then also upgrade and treat that brine into some type of usable water source. So really doing a lot of interesting things on the field side to move this forward in commercial deployment. So looking at some of our other activities, we did recently have a new regional deployment initiative, which was a current funding opportunity announcement. We're looking to move forward with the Carbon Safe Phase 3. Carbon Safe was primarily 2 phases we had, which were just doing pre-feasibility and feasibility studies. We're looking at Phase 3 where we're doing more detailed site characterization. Looking for the subsurface, how can we apply machine learning applications and really focusing on real-time control? What are some ways we can, say, make instantaneous type decisions as opposed to, say, waiting for data, pulling it back, taking a look at it? Are there ways that we can leverage some of the machine learning applications that are in development? And finally, tying into that transformational sensor development for the subsurface. How can we better see the subsurface and get a picture? Kind of think of this as the CT scan for the subsurface. How can we get better visualization? Basically taking all of this information and putting it out there. We have a whole host of knowledge sharing products. We have a carbon storage atlas, so really best practice manuals, really trying to get this information out to the public and others to see. So just a quick slide to wrap up. The U.S., we are a global leader in this area. Historically, there's 40 years of enhanced soil recovery in Texas.
over 600 million tons of CO2 have been injected and associatedly stored within those formations. Over 4,000 miles of CO2 pipelines, strong efforts, in developing human capital. I might be up here talking about this, but there's, hundreds and thousands of scientists and engineers who have been working on these efforts and projects to really move the ball forward. It's successful investing in demos, leading one of the most, active, and I would say one of the most successful CCUS R&D portfolios in the world. So with that, thank you, and I will if you have any questions, for when we're at the panel or at the end, more than happy to stick around and take some questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Marc, very much. Yes, we're going to hold our questions until the end, and there will be some time. I'll also invite, there are a couple of seats that became free, so I'll invite people who are standing to take a seat. And I'm really excited to introduce Shannon Angielski, whom we've met, who's the Executive Director of the Carbon Utilization Research Council. She's going to talk about 45Q, which is a tax credit, which was passed as a result of a landmark bipartisan cooperation. And there's no better person to talk about 45Q because CURC and Shannon and also the Carbon Capture Coalition played such a significant role in enabling the passage of what the global CCS considers the most progressive global incentive for carbon capture and storage.
Thank you, Lee. Who here knows what 45Q is? Or maybe I should say, who here doesn't? Okay. And does everybody know how it works, how the tax credit program works? Anybody? Oh, good. Well then, good. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, and I wanted to put a little bit of that into context. But first, let me just say thank you, Lee, for that introduction. There were so many stakeholders involved in the development of this legislation, as well as many policymakers in this room and outside of this room, but here on Capitol Hill, as well as within the administration. So it took several years of trying to bring together the what I call the two bookends of bipartisan support together. I mean, if there's anything right now that is bipartisan for addressing climate solutions and innovative solutions, it is carbon capture. And so it is also a very, what I want to call low-hanging fruit, and is a real opportunity for us to get work done, I think, here. And so we appreciate seeing all of you here, because I think that just shows the amount of support and the opportunity that exists to do something and actually achieve not just real emissions reductions, but actually, the one thing that's really interesting about carbon capture, and we say this about almost all of our energy technology innovation solutions, but there's a real economic opportunity for this country too. So what I'm going to talk about, as Lee said, is to talk a little bit about the 45Q program, but not only that, I bet you all are wondering, it's about almost a year and a half later, what are the impacts of it? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. I just wanted to start by reminding everybody sort of where the point source emissions of CO2 come from here in this country. And you can see that breakdown there in that pie chart. The majority of emissions come from the power sector. And then we do have a significant amount of emissions that come from the other industrial processes. So that's why carbon capture is really interesting, as well as something from a technical perspective, something that we are trying to address in order to make an impact in all of these industries. Because if you were to look at this on a global scale, it's almost like the invert of what this is. It's on a global scale, you're going to see more emissions coming from industrial processes than you will see from the electric power sector. But here in this country, we have a lot of work to do, I think, across industries. And so trying to find those technology solutions in carbon capture and integrating them is one of the things that is that we're trying to accomplish. So just a reminder of what carbon capture is, but this is why it's important. Carbon capture on your point source. This is something that we've been doing here in this country for many years in many industries. Okay, so on its own, we've been capturing carbon from a variety of industrial processes. Think one, when you refine oil, they have to strip the CO2 and then they use it for something. So in other industrial processes, that's one way to capture carbon. So just keep that in mind that we've been doing it. And then we've also been transporting carbon dioxide in pipelines for many years. We have pipelines, miles of pipelines across this country. And then we are also taking that CO2 and putting it into the ground. We know how to do it in enhanced solar recovery. We've been doing that since, for almost half a century. So what we haven't done is put all of those elements together. And I shouldn't say we haven't done, we have. But we don't have enough projects that integrate all of those elements together, so that way we know the impact of all of those elements from an operational perspective, but also just in terms of making sure that we know how to finance these big projects. Because it's not just the capture project or the enhanced oil recovery or geologic storage project we're looking to do. We're looking to get the full integrated project in the picture around that. And that's where 45Q comes in. I'm just showing this by way of example, okay? So I just mentioned that all of those elements we haven't integrated together. So these costs across industry sectors, and this is from the International Energy Agency, that shows what that integrated cost, the added cost of doing business is for capturing carbon. And that's the full system cost. And so you can see just in these different industry sectors, the difference in costs. One of the biggest costs in carbon capture, utilization and storage, is really on the carbon capture side. And part of that is due to the fact that you have different carbon dioxide concentrations in the flue gas streams. So when they're very high concentrations, it takes less energy in order to remove that carbon dioxide from the flue gas stream. And so there's less cost associated. And so it's really those higher concentration industries that you see that are on the lower cost side. And then they go up the curve in cost as you look at this chart. But this is just an example just to show you the different industries and the different costs associated with different applications of the technology. This is why that's important and why I wanted to show you this full integrated system. This is actually a chart that is now aged that DOE did many years ago, but I think it's useful to point this out. This is where 45Q, in addition to a variety of other policies that have been mentioned already, and I'll mention two as well, where 45Q is going to help carbon capture come down on that cost curve. We're already seeing it come down on that cost curve. I don't have a place for it yet on this cost curve, and that's something that we're going to look at, and I'm going to ask Marc to go take homework back to DOE to help us do that. But CO2 capture is already coming down on this cost curve. We want the set of policies, sort of that sustained aggressive policy support in the same way that renewables and other technologies that we see in the energy sector received, to help us bring down that cost curve. And we can get there from here. And 45Q is catalyzing that right now. So this is your 45Q lesson. How does it work? 45Q is a lot like a production tax credit. You actually have to be capturing the CO2 and putting it into the ground in order to claim your tax credit. An entity, the taxpayer, literally submits a tax form at the end of the year to claim their tax credits, okay? So that's why we need to have all of the upfront aspects of the 45Q tax credit program addressed, so that way taxpayers know that they will be able to claim that tax credit once they are capturing and storing CO2. One important change from the original program is that it's not just carbon dioxide, but carbon oxides that are the eligible source of COX, is what we call it, for claiming the tax credit. And the reason why that's important is because some of the gases that come off of other industrial processes, for example, in the steel making process, they come in the form of a carbon oxide, or COX. So, and that also can lend itself, that X can also be a carbon dioxide molecule. So I just want to point that out, that that's one important change, to make sure that we capture all of those carbon oxides coming off of flue gas streams. Another is that to provide certainty, the tax credit has a sunset date. It's January 1st, 2024. But you know that if you commence construction before that date, you will be eligible for the tax credit. We'll come back to that in a minute. The tax credit claiming period, if you're eligible, you can claim that tax credit for 12 years. I use an estimate. If you look at just a standard coal-fired power plant that's capturing 2 million tons of carbon dioxide a year and putting it in the ground or storing it, that's almost it's well over $800 million over the life of the project, if you think about it that way, if you're using it for enhanced oil recovery at a $35 a ton value. So just to give you a sense of what the magnitude is here of this tax credit, that's where that 12-year period is really important. The tax credit value is increasing over the life of a project. Over a 10-year escalation period. So I mentioned the $35 a ton. Right now it's at $10 a ton. So it'll go from $10 to $35 over a 10-year period, and then it will cap at $35. Same with geologic storage, currently at 20, and it will cap at 50. And then a new tax credit category was created for what is called carbon utilization or CO2 utilization, which is a process where if you capture CO2 and you convert that CO2 into some other byproduct. So some people liken this to using the algae as, the CO2 as a feedstock in algae and to make biofuels. It's just one example, but that's a new tax credit category that was created with this program. And as you can see, those, at least the 12-year credit claiming period and that increase in the dollar per ton value of the tax credit, these are the aspects of the 45Q program that we were trying to get at to help reduce the cost of these early pioneer carbon capture projects that will be deployed with this tax credit. And that's where the tax credit program is really important. Direct air capture is also a new technology that is eligible to receive the tax credit. We talked about that at the last briefing, but that's where carbon capture systems pull CO2 out of the air, and then once you capture that CO2, you store it or use it in some other way. Another important aspect of the tax credit is that the taxpayer, for purposes of being eligible for the tax credit, is the taxpayer that owns the carbon capture facility. But you can transfer that tax credit through the project itself. So if the EOR operator could use that tax credit, then you can transfer and elect to transfer that tax credit down to the EOR operator as one example. The other aspect of this is that the eligibility criteria have changed. And this is important because we were trying to really incentivize new entrants into carbon capture as well. So as I mentioned, the tax credit or the taxpayer shifted to the entity that's that owns the carbon capture facility, but also the CO2 thresholds that you see up here. These were included in original legislation, and the threshold was that you had to capture and store 500,000 tons a year in order to be able to be eligible for the tax credit. And that's still the case for electric power generators. But we adjusted it for other industrial emitters because some of these industrial processes don't emit as much CO2 on an annual basis. Some of these technologies we're trying to look at so that way they can actually be demonstrated in a first of a kind setting. So we wanted to make sure that we incentivize those actions. So that's why the 100,000 ton limit was set. And then 25,000 tons for what is deemed to be pilot projects, and this is in CO2 that's stored in a utilization project, because some of those technologies are going to be on a much smaller scale, and we wanted to make sure that they have the benefit of the tax credit as well. So what are the impacts of the tax credits? I'm going to come back to some of these financial impacts in a minute, but I really wanted to focus on environmental impacts to start with, and this is just high level. I'm not even really exhausting what these impacts are, but I already mentioned that this tax credit program is really going to be the catalyst for CCUS industry in this country. So environmental impacts, Lee is going to talk more about this, but Global CCS Institute has done analysis, and they're already showing that right now, on an annual basis, we're capturing almost 30 million tons a year in the carbon capture sector. The 45Q tax credit has the ability to double and even triple that amount on an annual basis. That's huge if we can do that. And we'd like to hope, we'd like to see that happen and hope to see that happen. And I also mentioned that this is the first real direct incentive for direct air capture. So if we're looking to get to the 2-degree scenario or even below that, we'll need direct air capture, and so this technology and this tax credit will really act to incentivize those technologies to be deployed. Economic impacts. There's been some modeling studies done. I'm just going to mention a couple at this point. But really, what we're looking for is investment in a new industry. What we need to do is, if you remember the different elements of carbon capture projects, it's going to incentivize that supply chain. Carbon capture, you're going to have equipment manufacturers that are going to start to be able to build out equipment. That's new jobs. You're going to see pipelines being built. You're going to see EOR operations expand. And you're gonna see geologic storage opportunities and direct air capture. So that's where you're gonna see a new industry emerge, and that's where we're gonna see a lot of impact, which will create those macroeconomic benefits here to the US. If we can export those technologies, even better. So on utilization markets, there's been a study conducted that estimates 1 trillion in new domestic carbon product markets per year, and that can go upwards of almost 6 trillion globally per year. You can see that Carbon 180 is responsible for that. There's also been analysis done by my organization in conjunction with Clear Path Action. We were looking at how can we make carbon a commodity from a market-driven perspective. If we invest in the research and development that's needed, that's also needed to improve the technology and bring down the cost. The study estimates that we could see anywhere between 270 to 780,000 new jobs in this country be created. And then anywhere between 65 to $190 billion increase in GDP. These are just examples. The point is that there's a real opportunity here, and I just wanted to make sure that that's, that you all understand the macro impacts to these technologies. It will be a real return on not just the federal investment with this tax credit program, but also the private sector investment. So what are these investment impacts? This is something that's really important to realize, because this is one of the key metrics, not metric, but one of the elements that led to the success of the renewable energy industry, seeing a real reduction in costs of deploying those technologies. Investment impacts are really important to this. We are seeing the investment community looking at this tax credit as a new market, and they are now really seriously evaluating carbon capture projects. If you think about the need for learn by doing that's needed to actually see that be impacted in practice through carbon capture projects, the investment community also needs to do the same thing. They need to understand how carbon capture projects are going to work, but then also how to think about modeling financial tools to invest in projects, also using the 45Q tax credit. So think of the renewable tax credits. Those catalyzed the investment community thinking and launched a lot of the investments into those tax credits, but the investment community had to come up with new tools, and they had to understand how those projects were going to work. And so if we see more of that happen, we are going to see a huge amount of efficiency built into the investment community's understanding of how to invest in these projects and create new tools that will help in the long term as well. So just some example projects that have been announced, at least as a result of 45Q. This is one that was announced very early last year after enactment. Occidental Petroleum and White Energy are studying carbon capture from an ethanol project. And that would be down in Texas and putting CO2 into one of Oxy's oil fields. But you can see here, I mean, Vicki Hollick has been a real champion in the industry to try to pioneer on carbon capture, and Oxy's investing in all of those industrial applications of carbon capture. So you're going to see a lot from Occidental Petroleum. I wanted to also point out it's working on existing coal plants here in this country. Project Tundra is a collaboration with Dakota Power Cooperatives, Square Butte Electric, and BNI Energy to look at capturing carbon dioxide off an existing coal plant in North Dakota. And they have indicated that they would like to use the tax credit to put the CO2 into secure geologic storage, one of the first announced projects that would likely be doing that. So that's something that we really need to advance and pioneer on the geologic storage side, and they're already well ahead of the curve on that. Another Oxy investment is for net power. I think Marc may have mentioned the supercritical carbon dioxide cycles. These are new power cycles that could use coal or synthetic natural gas in a direct fired cycle. And so there's real opportunities here in investing in these new technologies, and Oxy is doing that. 45Q is one opportunity to see the future market emerge for these new technologies to be deployed. And then direct air capture, I mentioned. Again, Oxy has made an announcement that they're investing in a project. So I'm not going to dwell on these projects, but just wanted to show you that there's real action taking place. And this is just examples. There are other projects, some of which have been announced publicly, some that have not, but I just selected a few just to point out for you today. I wanted to talk about the project timeline, and this is a timeline for looking at it on a retrofit of Project Tundra. That they have this on their website. But I just wanted to point out that these are they're very large capital-intensive projects with each of these different elements of the supply chain that need to be accounted for when you're looking at project development. And the reason why this is important is because although they started to do paper studies back in 2015, they really got serious about the project in 2016-17 and started to make more investments and really put more development into design that will lead to a project being launched sometime, as you can see, in the 2022 to 2024 timeframe. It's difficult to estimate with precision when these projects will actually commence construction, but as you can see, sort of the time from thinking about it to the time from actual construction and operation can take some time. And that was really what I wanted to point out for you here in using this example for a project that's been announced. And the reason why that's important is because I mentioned that sunset date for 45Q. I think many of you may be aware of all of the renewable tax credit annual expirations and some of those that have been retroactively passed here. You know, the 45Q tax credits are now going to see a very similar situation with a sunset date of commenced construction by January 1, 2024. And that's important for these projects that are much bigger, take a long time to plan and develop and actually get steel in the ground that would qualify you for that commenced construction. So since IRS has not yet issued guidance on this, we're still trying to understand the rules of the road. On July 4th, comments are due to IRS for a notice that they issued requesting comments on the program. We're hopeful that they will act pretty quickly after that to put some guidance out that will then tell not only project developers, but then also the financial investors that need to know what the rules of the road will be, that they know how to use this tax credit in a project. Legislation or other existing programs, and I'm just going to go through this briefly, but I wanted to make sure that you all know that there is an existing DOE fossil energy loan guarantee program that would authorize DOE to issue up to $8 billion in loan guarantees for CCS projects or CCUS projects. So that's one that's available. Other legislation that has been introduced, it was already mentioned, the fossil energy research and development legislation. There's also a Senate bill called the EFFECT Act, which would essentially be a companion to a House version of that bill. There is a bill called the Utilizing Significant Emissions and Innovative Technologies Act, looking at investing in CO2 utilization, direct air capture, and streamlining CO2 pipeline infrastructure as well as carbon capture infrastructure. A tax credit program called the Carbon Capture Modernization Act would modify an existing tax credit program for retrofitting carbon capture on existing coal plants. And then there's also legislation that's designed to help reduce the cost of financing. Financing Our Any Future Act, which is really looking to make carbon capture eligible for master limited partnerships. And then also the Carbon Capture Improvement Act, which would allow businesses to use private activity bonds to finance CCUS projects. So that was a lot. I'm going to leave it at that, but thank you again for all joining us today to learn more about this. I am going to turn it over to Lee, who is the Senior Advisor from the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. She's going to talk about the status of carbon capture both here and internationally. And after that, we'll take questions. Thank you, Lee.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shannon. Yes, I'm really excited to talk about the global status of CCS. The Institute releases a report with the same title every year at the Conference of the Parties. So the last one was released in Poland, and the next one we're releasing in Chile. And so before I get into it, show of hands, who thinks there are less than 5 operational CCS projects globally? Less than 10? Less than 20? Okay, we'll get to this in a second. So this is just a quick friendly reminder. This is the International Energy Agency's Sustainable Development Scenario, which shows how the world could reach the goals outlined in the Paris Agreement, but also all energy-related sustainable development goals. And the upper line is where we're moving right now with current and announced policies, which is more like 3+ degrees of warming. The lower line is where we're looking to get. And as you can see, there are really 3 things from that slide. One, CCS isn't a silver bullet solution, but sits as a portfolio of decarbonization options. 2, CCS is expected to contribute roughly 7% of global emissions reduction, which would translate into 2,400 million tons of carbon being captured by 2040 every year, which is roughly 2,000 facilities globally, half in the industrial sector, half in the power sector, half in emerging market, and half in advanced economies. And then finally, it also shows that that carbon capture and storage is really going to pick up and scale by the 2030s. And that's why we're looking to commercialize this technology and deploy it at scale today. So yes, there are 46 facilities globally, 18 in operation, 5 under construction, and 23 in various stages of development. And as you can see, as we've learned today, the US has 10 out of the 18 operational facilities is a clear global leader. There's 1 coal-fired power plant, the other 9 are in the industrial sector. Europe has recently caught up, especially in the industrial sector and in hydrogen production, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then finally, in China and Asia, we're seeing also hydrogen production and coal-fired power plant retrofits. So, as we learned earlier today, carbon capture and storage has been around since the 1970s. And since then, we've safely and permanently stored 250 million tons of CO2 per year. Currently, as Shannon already said, we're capturing roughly 33 million tons of CO2 every year, which is the equivalent of taking off the 7 million cars off the road for 1 year. And just to also give you an overview, to be on track to climate goals, the International Energy Agency estimates that we would need, in the 2030s, operating 350 million tons of CO2 being captured in the power sector and 400 million tons in the industrial sector. So it is possible because we've cumulatively stored already 250 million tons, but that's what we need to store annually. So we're looking at an immediate and urgent need for scale up. So this is just an overview of the project pipeline. So as we've learned, the 45Q is the most progressive CCS incentive globally. It's also complemented by California's amendment to the low carbon fuel standard. They attached the CCS protocol to the low carbon fuel standard, which played a role in some recent project announcements. So we're seeing a replenished pipeline. China, various projects in the early development, especially coal-fired power plant retrofits in an effort to alleviate air pollution, which the country obviously battles with. Europe, industrial sector and hydrogen production. And then in the Middle East, there is the first and only steel plant with CCS. This slide, we're really trying to give you an overview of when these projects will come online and what different industries they're in. So if you're looking at the big green bubble, for example, that's an Australian project on an LNG terminal where the government made it a conditionality for project approval to have CCS on that processing facility. Then there are the Norwegian full chain project, which is a cement. The Norwegian government is currently evaluating a full chain cement plant as well as a fertilizer plant, waste to energy, sorry. But there is also fertilizer can also be used for carbon capture and storage. Sleipner and Snøhvit are very successful projects in Norway on LNG and offshore gas production. In the US, we have a lot of steam methane reforming, one power plant, as we mentioned, and then also an ethanol project, which we talked about earlier in the Midwest. Just a word about hydrogen, which is a topic the Global CCS Institute is seeing take off everywhere in the world, but the United States, despite the US having a near perfect conditions for the large-scale deployment of hydrogen through natural resources. So as many people are actually surprised, 98% of hydrogen globally is produced from fossil fuels, currently creating as many emissions as the UK and Indonesia combined. This process can be abated with carbon capture and storage, is a low-cost carbon capture and storage opportunity. And we're seeing this global race to kind of produce the clean energy vector of the future take off everywhere. So as I said, in Europe, the UK is looking to decarbonize 3 million homes from natural gas by switching from natural gas to hydrogen for home heating, and is looking to produce that hydrogen with natural gas and carbon capture. The same in the Netherlands, where they're testing natural gas to hydrogen fuel switching. And then in Japan is looking to become an entirely hydrogen fuel society, for example, by importing hydrogen that's been produced from abundant brown coal in Australia with carbon capture. So as I said, it's almost this clean energy vector of the future, because many think it can kickstart the energy transition today, because you can unleash this abundant amount of hydrogen to create demand, to create the infrastructure, and then can blend in electrolysis, so green hydrogen produced from renewables later. And we think that the US has actually perfect preconditions, because you have all the expertise, you have the perfect policy framework through 45Q and the LCFS, which both incentivize hydrogen production with carbon capture and storage. And then finally, you also have cheap natural gas. So I'll just leave it with this. We're very excited about the project in Europe and everywhere else. Earlier this year, the Institute also undertook a review of all carbon capture and storage projects currently in operation and under construction to kind of identify, okay, what made these projects happen. And as you can see, there are basically three framers. The one is a value on carbon, so that's 45Q in the United States. In Norway, it's a carbon tax on offshore gas. There's also enhanced recovery places a value on carbon because it provides a commercial commodity. And then finally, second, it's creating an environment enabling investment. So what we've seen that most of these projects received little to no private debt funding, but were kind of financed through multiple shares of government structured funding, capital grants, even government ownership globally. So what can be done, what governments can help with, is really help reduce the cost of capital through de-risking. And I think that the policies that Shannon has discussed do a good job on this. And then finally, also access to infrastructure. So CO2, all of these projects either had access to CO2 infrastructure or were storing it right underground. So there's a couple of policy priorities that you can take into account when designing policies that really help these. These are just the characteristics that help these projects succeed. And as I said very early, actually my first words were that in 2018 we finally saw the stars for carbon capture and storage align, and that resulted in a huge policy efforts globally, especially aided by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 1.5 degree report, which included carbon capture and storage in 3 of 4 scenarios. So what we're seeing is that in Europe, we've seen the carbon capture and storage discussion being kickstarted, inclusion in European Union long-term strategy. Even Germany, the Netherlands, the UK really have emerged and are looking at carbon capture because they realized you can really bring about climate emissions reductions relatively easy with low-hanging fruit such as energy efficiency and renewable energy. But if you're looking for higher climate ambition, reducing your emissions, for example, to net zero, then carbon capture and storage has a role to play in decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors. So that's why we're seeing this correlation between climate ambitious states or countries and carbon capture and storage policy interests. As I said, the UK strives to become a leader. The same Norwegian government is very involved, and we're very grateful. The same for China and Japan. So we're seeing this policy confidence and policy interest globally, and we're still looking for the US to share its lessons and also its experience in deploying carbon capture and storage, given that it's been the global leader. So finally, I just want to talk about the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which took effect earlier this year. So the California Air Resources Board amended its low carbon fuel standard, which seeks to reduce the emissions intensity of fuels by 20% by 2030 with a protocol for carbon capture and storage. So projects that reduce the life cycle emissions of fuels consumed in California are eligible to generate credits, as well as direct air capture projects globally. The credits are currently trading at $180 and can be combined with 45Q, which basically combines to a super incentive to deploy carbon capture and storage. And from the Institute's perspective, we really welcome this policy because we think, first of all, it's innovative. It shows that CCS can make not only an impact in industrial and power sector emissions, but also in the transportation sector. But second of all, it's also this acknowledgement that with rising climate ambition, which we've seen California lead on, there is this acknowledgement that carbon capture and storage is needed. So this is my last slide. Thank you so much for bearing with us today. Thank you so much for coming. And I think we're going to take some questions, right? Any questions? Yeah. Right here in front.
What is the impact of storing CO2 on either offshore or underground on land on the biodiversity in the area and also for neighboring communities?
Sorry, can you repeat that again?
Sure. So what's the impact of storing CO2 either offshore or underground on land on the biodiversity in the area and also on neighboring communities?
Yeah, so when you're looking at, when you're doing the carbon storage project, offshore, we haven't really done much in that space in the US. But looking at it in terms of onshore storage, it all comes down to doing your site characterization work up front. So what that means is, making sure that you have the resource available, where you're going to put your wells, what sort of monitoring do you have is required, and all that's regulated by EPA through something called the Underground Injection Control Class 6 permit. So, that's setting the guidelines basically for what you're doing in terms of your carbon storage project. So, in terms of impact, I mean, we haven't really seen anything from the projects that we've been working on.
So I guess it's a multiple-part question. In terms of trying to bring this kind of technology to the developing world, first of all, what kind of market can we see for carbon capture that becomes self-sustainable? And what I mean by that is, other than EOR, what other uses are there for the carbon that is captured to then be reused in another market? The second question is, are carbon capture projects, can they take advantage of World Bank and IMF funds for low capital countries, or are those countries do they have to find funding for those projects on their own? And finally, we've talked a lot about 45Q obviously, and how that's a domestic tax credit, but how does carbon capture compete abroad without 45Q?
So I think you had about 5 questions wrapped up in there. So I'll maybe take one or two of the technical pieces, and then I know I touched on 45Q and the finance. So in terms of the technical side on carbon utilization, that was the one question that you had. Besides EOR, there's mineralization concepts, basically turning it into building products, cement, concrete. Algae is another one. We're still looking at the biological approaches of converting it. And then, some of the more difficult or challenging ones, because, CO2 is a thermodynamically stable molecule that would require energy, are some of those looking at CO2 to, fuel, so basically cracking CO2 into, say, carbon monoxide or other constituents, and then combining it with hydrogen and producing fuels in that manner. So those are some of the options. Mineralization concepts are probably some of the more near-term ones, just because they're a little more robust and easier to take forward. In terms of looking at deploying capture technologies globally, a lot of it's going to be dependent on the market conditions within those particular countries. You know, and you know, it's going to be different in China than it is going to be in the U.S., and it's going to be different in Europe as well. So a lot of it's going to be dependent on the market and policies in those countries. I don't know, 45Q or...
So yes, there are, the World Bank does have, actually it has policies where if they're going to finance any fossil fuel projects, or at least on a coal plant, it has to have CCS. So it's just a question of how much does the financing help to reduce the cost to have it deployed in some of those emerging economies where they are looking for really inexpensive forms of power. So, and again, I mentioned earlier that right now, the cost of CCS is still enough that it's too high in some applications, and so that could be one thing that could be a challenge in trying to get some of those projects done, at least in emerging economies. But in terms of 45Q, all I can say, at least with that, is that the U.S. is on the international radar screen and actually putting a value on carbon dioxide in a way that incentivizes this. Whether other countries actually adopt similar policies is, I think, a big question, but they're likely wanting to wait and see how we do with this policy and how impactful it is. So, but they're outside of actually having a carbon pricing mechanism. You know, 45Q is likely to be isolated, at least here, in terms of its impact in the U.S., unless other countries adopt similar policies. Go ahead. We have a few questions here.
For 45Q, for existing facilities, Chute Creek, Lost Cabin, we're capturing, processing natural gas and pulling out CO2. Do they have to do anything different to be eligible for 45Q? Or, in other words, is there a start?
So there was. So with they may have been eligible for the original 45Q tax credit enacted back in 2008. There is a requirement in the Future Act that you had to put your capture equipment, had to commence construction or be placed in service after the date of enactment. So that would be the one threshold that they would have to cross in order to be eligible, at least in terms of timing. There's a question over here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We showed a graph where it was the path of decarbonization, and there was CCS made up 7% of that. I think that was about a national decarbonization path rather than global. But my question is, what does that actually look like approximately? How many projects and how much more infrastructure, their estimation on that?
Yes, so for the 7%, that's globally. That's a sustainable development scenario, which reaches Paris Agreement and all energy-related sustainable development goals. So the 7% translates into 2,400 million tons being captured annually by 2040, which is roughly, if you're assuming 1.5 million tons on average per project into 2,000 projects, of which half are roughly expected to be in the industrial sector, half in the power sector, half in emerging markets, and half in advanced economies. But this is just one scenario. There are many scenarios.
Where can we access your slides online?
Yes, we will. We have this briefing recorded, and we will upload the slides and the briefing once we have it available on the Carbon Utilization Research Council website and the Global CCS Institute's website.
So, if we give us one URL.
Oh, it's globalccsinstitute.com.
Okay.
I'm happy to also circulate it with the registration list.
What are your thoughts on carbon fee or cap and trade legislation and how that might present an economic incentive for carbon capture?
So as I said, one of the policy priorities is a value on carbon. So the U.S. has a value on carbon with 45Q. The International Energy Agency estimated that with an incentive of $40, which is less than 45Q, you could see the deployment of 400 million tons of CO2 being captured. And I guess we leave it to governments to hammer out what exactly a value on carbon. There are different ways of placing a value on carbon. Any more questions? Yes, in the back.
Hi, I'm Alex Kraut. I'm with the U.S. Energy Association. Just want to do a quick little plug. On Thursday, we're having a briefing on the San Juan Generating Station in New Mexico and a possible CCUS project involved. And then also going back to that biodiversity question, I think it needs to be considered that with sequestration, you're pumping CO2 like thousands of feet into the ground, into saline reservoirs, rock formations. So I would think that the impact on biological diversity is pretty minimal. I could be wrong on that, but just a comment.
Hi, sorry. So with the need for like negative energy technologies in relatively like quick manner, do you guys get like Becks at all? Biological carbon capture situation? Like is that considered in any of these models? Or what do we need to do policy-wise and financial structure-wise to make that more feasible?
So I don't think there are negative emissions technologies reflected in this scenario, but there are other scenarios. In particular, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change includes Becks or negative emissions in a larger chunk in all of its scenarios. So what was the second part of your question?
So I guess the costs associated with something like Becks right now aren't really feasible. It would be even flat if you're running a Becks operation. What sort of legislation or financial structures would we put in place that would, help out current negative
I think from a technology perspective, when you're looking at it from a, if say looking at ethanol facilities, the CO2 coming off an ethanol facility is 90+%. So all you're really doing is dehydration, compression, and storage, or utilization. So it's actually, for a facility like that, it's probably easier than, say, a coal-fired power plant because of the concentration. So that concentration drives a lot of the cost. So for ethanol facilities, I would expect it to be a little bit easier.
And all I would do to follow up on that is just to say that 45Q is source agnostic, so it would incentivize or actually incentivize BECS. It would just be incumbent on markets or otherwise in looking to utilize the fuel coming off of that facility in order to actually incentivize the plant developer or the project developer to invest in, or an investor to invest in the project. So that's the beauty of 45Q, is that it's flexible across all applications as well as to try to incentivize even BECS, direct air capture or otherwise. Okay, I think we are out of time.
Well, thank you everyone so much for coming and staying over time. I know we went over time. This is amazing. And please don't hesitate to reach out should you have any questions. We're here to answer any questions all around carbon capture. And next briefing will be on July 25. And we already have great speakers. 3 senators, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Capitol Moore, and Senator Barrasso. So we're really exciting. And it will be in the Capitol Visitors Center. Thank you so much for coming.